Dorothy, for those of you who don't know, but I think probably everybody here does, is the curator of painting and sculpture and the curator of performance art at the National Portrait Gallery. She's very, very busy. It's a very long resume, so I won't read everything. But I think there's some really important initiatives here, and Dorothy has made a really huge impact on the Portrait Gallery and on art here in the area and further afield. So she's coordinating the Smithsonian Women's History Initiative, which is super important. She directs the Outwin Buccifer portrait competition. She inaugurated the performance series at the Portrait Gallery. She's curated a number of really wonderful exhibitions. Most recently, I think, was The Sweat of Their Faces. The Sweat of Their Face, Portraits of American Workers, which was really, really a wonderful exhibition with an accompanying catalog. Before being at the Portrait Gallery, she was at the Corcoran Gallery of Art and taught with Smith College and the Smithsonian. So we're very, very pleased to have Dorothy here. She's written a number of wonderful essays and reviews, including one about Caitlin's work previously, which is why one of the reasons we thought it would be nice to invite her here and have her share her thoughts about where the work is now. So thank you, Dorothy.
Thank you so much, Lily, and thank you all for being here. Thank you to your staff and to the board of the Greater Reston Art Center. I think that so much exciting work is happening in the Washington area in the arts, and this is truly one of the most dynamic places where contemporary art is shown, and I really applaud Lily for your hard work in making this such a vibrant, dynamic space and a community building space. So thank you so much. And thank you, Caitlin, for being you and for making work that is exciting to think about, that is really in dialogue with so much of what's happening in scholarship on contemporary art and in our world. And I had a fun time sort of meditating on the current work. I have written on Caitlin's past work, Strangers on the Beach, no, Stranger Lives. I was thinking of my title, but I really enjoyed thinking about that project. And I got to know Caitlin with an earlier project of hers, which I'll talk about momentarily. But before I jump into my thoughts on Caitlin's work, I do want to say something about the Smithsonian Women's History Initiative, which is just getting launched. We had a small event last week to thank some of the donors who have come together behind it. There is significant funding behind this initiative from the Ford Foundation, from Congress, from private supporters like Melinda Gates. There's a group of 100 women who have given $100,000 towards it, and more is coming, which just shows how much people want to see women's history, women artists celebrated, and it's not just about the arts, it's about women's history across disciplines. So you'll see a more visible presence of women across the entire Smithsonian institution soon. And it's a really exciting moment for us, and I'm thrilled whenever I get to talk about this, because finally there is significant support and there's actually incentive in the administration of the Smithsonian for us to do more with women artists, and it's about time. So I'm really looking forward to that, and I'd be happy to talk more with you all about that after this. And it relates to what I'm going to say today, because I've been actually thinking a lot about how to write about women artists. And there was a period of time when you were sort of taught not to talk about motherhood in scholarship. That, you know, the artwork speaks for itself. Let's not go too deeply into biography on women artists. And that was sort of the second wave of feminists who were my professors. And I went to Smith College. I went to a women's college, and I was encouraged to write and think about women in a theoretical way and women's work. But I was never told to write biography into scholarship. And I think that's really changing. Just recently, I heard a brilliant lecture by the art historian Helen Molesworth, who spoke in the Clary Smith lecture series at the Smithsonian American Art Museum. Were any of you there by any chance? She was reflecting on work she has done recently on Ruth Asawa, who is very well known in California and less well known on the East Coast, but Helen's work is bringing her definitely to the forefront. And there's a beautiful exhibition of her work right now at the Pulitzer in St. Louis, if anyone is headed to St. Louis in the next couple of months. But Helen Molesworth, I've always admired for her rigor in discussing art and theory, and she said that she really feels that motherhood is back on the table when we talk about women artists. And she had a statement during her talk where she says, quote, "My hope is that feminist art history can begin to work toward a method striated with complexity about these matters," meaning women who are wives and mothers. "I crave a discipline capable of negotiating the formal and the biographical, one skillful at navigating systems of value that are cognizant of their sexist formation but not beholden to reiterating that sexism at every turn." And so I want to talk about Caitlin's work today in terms of how it relates to her identity as a mother and how that is such a fruitful part of her new body of work, and how her work can be seen through that lens in relationship to Ruth Asawa's work, who was also a mother and an activist, and to Sylvia Plath's work. I recently curated a show on Sylvia Plath, and she wrote beautifully about her experience of being a new mother, and I wanted to share some of that work because she saw that as a generative experience that was helping her create new and exciting writing. And then also Wanda Raimundi Ortiz, who is an artist based in Orlando, who I had the pleasure of working with as part of the National Portrait Gallery's Identified Performance Art series, and her work reflected on motherhood, so I'll share that with you. But as we get started, I wanted to share this image because this is how I got to know Caitlin. This is a portrait titled Leslie, and it's from her Annabelle series. And in an interview she did with the National Portrait Gallery, she wrote, "In Annabelle, women stand transfixed in and among severe everyday landscapes, connected to the world by the objects surrounding them. Each frame is carefully constructed, but what lies just beyond is uncertain, perhaps threatening, and ultimately left for wonder. These women, with strength and wisdom and the depth of their age, stand boldly and carefully alone. They offer us the opportunity to create stories about life and death, power and vulnerability, magnificence and uncertainty." And I believe this body of work looking at middle-aged and older women was done when you were not a mother yet. Mm-hmm. Is that correct? Yes. So you're looking at your future, through the lens of these women who are at a pivotal stage in life. And I love the thoughtfulness in the expressions on the faces in this series. And there's always this sort of hint of death in these images, which look to me like film stills. And I was so struck when I saw this by the light that sort of, comes across her neck, and her thoughtfulness and her strength and her contemplativeness. You want to know what's in her mind. I was just so drawn by this. And this is a photograph that Caitlin entered into our Atwood Bootcheaver portrait competition, and it was a finalist in the 2013 competition and drew a lot of praise and a lot of press. So this is how I got to know Caitlin, through these images of older women. Now I mentioned Ruth Asawa. Ruth Asawa was someone who was very engaged in her family life and was often photographed with her artwork, with her children surrounding her. And this is a photograph taken by Imogen Cunningham, who I think you've spoken of as an influence on your work.
Not specifically, but I definitely know
But someone
her
you
work. Yeah.
admired. So she was a photographer in the 1950s and early 1960s. She was older than Ruth Osawa and made many beautiful photographs of Osawa in her studio and with her family. Like Caitlin, Ruth Osawa was deeply engaged with her community. As you know, Caitlin is working on making affordable housing space, studio space available for artists in our community through Stable Arts. And Ruth Osawa was engaged in her community. Here she is with some of her work through creating arts programs in San Francisco public schools. She brought the arts to San Francisco public schools. And she often spoke about how important it is for children to be exposed to art, to learn about color and design and observing objects in nature, not just to be skilled at art making, but for any profession they might end up in later in life. It created a broader being in terms of relating to the world. And so I see Ruth Osawa's engagement with the arts and with schools and with children is very much deeply connected to her art practice and also to her identity as an artist and a mother, which is really inseparable. And she was very committed to talking about the importance of family life. So one thing that happened to her when she showed her work for the first time in the mid-1950s in New York, all the major critics wrote about her and called her an artist and a mother, a housewife and a mother and an artist, and that her work was really more about craft and not connected to the modern art world. But that did not stop her from taking her work seriously, and she continued to talk about the importance of motherhood in her art making practice and in her life and in her social justice work in the schools. And I think about Caitlin in terms of Osawa because I see you as someone who shares your family life with the curators you talk with. We talked about raising children. I have young children. The whole time we've known each other and how to navigate our lives as mothers and professionals, and how to actually involve our families and our children in our creative process. We don't think that there needs to be a separation. I think that's something that women of our generation like to embrace. So sort of the third wave of feminism. And in this photograph, I want to go back to this, you'll see that Ruth Osawa is not really exclusively concerned either with her children or with her art making. She's doing all of this at once. And the picture makes clear that she inhabits the role of artist and mother simultaneously with seeming ease. She's not sacrificing one to the other. And I love this. This really interests me because it seems to offer a way out of thinking that motherhood, and by extension, any other kind of labor that's gendered female, is antithetical to being an artist, or that you can't be one or the other, you can be both together, and that's actually very productive. And I also think of Sylvia Plath in this way. And as you all know, and I probably should have said at the beginning, if you don't know, that much of the work that was made here was made along walks that Caitlin took with her sons to daycare or to around the neighborhood, and collecting objects, collecting things that we might just look away from or might not even see, but collecting them, stashing them away, and then creating these beautiful compositions out of these objects that came from looking together and looking alongside her children to find these things. So to me, they're very deeply embedded in her role as a mother. and also the way that she involves her children in her creative process. So Sylvia Plath also involved her children, who were very, very little, in her creative process. Her daughter Frida was actually the only one who was old enough to be able to see her mother writing and know what was going on. Her son was born, Nicholas. He was very young when their mother died. So I'm thinking more of Frida here, but this is an installation of the exhibition that I curated. It's a one-gallery exhibition about Sylvia Plath's visual imagination, and I wanted to include her desk, which is hanging on the wall as the large plank. It's an elmwood desk that her husband Ted Hughes and her brother Warren found in England in a yard where people would go to look for wood for coffins. And they found this piece of elmwood that they sanded and planed, and it became her writing desk when she and Ted Hughes lived in Devon in the countryside. And I just love this artifact because in it you see, and it's hard, you can't really see it here, but you can see some of her inscriptions, some ink blots. It's a really rough piece of wood that almost looks like the trunk of a tree. It's quite animated in person. And on the other side of it, and I couldn't get a picture to include in this PowerPoint of this, there are little marks that are Frida's drawings. And so you imagine she must have been sitting underneath her mother's desk while she was writing. And Sylvia Plath would use various kinds of supports to lay the wood on. You could move this piece of wood as a desk all around for different views and different settings. But I love to imagine a little Frida drawing under the desk. And we all know what it's like when you're trying to do work and your child is near you and you're letting them entertain themselves in whatever way seems productive for you both. But I love just to imagine what this must have looked like in their home. And like Caitlin and like Ruth Asawa, Sylvia Plath was very much engaged in her time. She was very concerned about where the world was going. As a mother, she felt very protective of her children and wanted to make sure that they were safe. So she wrote in her journals about taking little Frida to march on Trafalgar Square against the hydrogen bomb. And she would make collages using Life magazines that her mother would send to England from their home in Wellesley, Massachusetts, that were reflecting on the current situation and some of her fears about the world. And then she wrote beautiful poetry about motherhood. And I'll read this one, which is called Morning Song, and it was written soon after the birth of Frida. Love set you going like a fat gold watch. The midwife slapped your foot soles, and your bald cry took its place among the elements. Our voices echo, magnifying your arrival. New statue in a drafty museum. Your nakedness shadows our safety. We stand round blankly as walls. I'm no more your mother than the cloud that distills a mirror to reflect its own slow effacement at the wind's hand. All night your moth breath flickers among the flat pink roses. I wake to listen. A far sea moves in my ear. One cry, and I stumble from bed, cow heavy and floral in my Victorian nightgown. Your mouth opens clean as a cat's. The window square whitens and swallows its dull stars. And now you try your handful of notes. The clear vowels rise like balloons. Something that really fascinated me about Sylvia Plath as a writer is I learned during my research for this exhibition that she was also a visual artist. And I think once you know that about her and you see her drawings and photographs, she loved the camera also, you realize that her writing is so vivid because she had a visual imagination. And some of her greatest work, I believe, is about her experience of being a young mother. At the very end of her life, she wrote a poem called Kindness. and it is also about being a mother. And the last line is what I wanted to focus on here. She writes, "The blood jet is poetry. There is no stopping it. You hand me 2 children, 2 roses." When she wrote this poem, and this is the draft, you see typewritten words on the back. You can kind of see those coming through. Those are comments about nannies that she was thinking of hiring. Ted Hughes had left her. She was really struggling with depression, but she wanted to keep writing. I mean, she had to write to survive. The blood jet is poetry. That was in her, and she needed to figure out how she could maintain her professional identity and be a mother. And her psychiatrist, who was in Boston and she corresponded with by mail, had written her just before she wrote this poem and said, "You have got to continue writing, and you've got to find help so that you can continue writing. So you need to hire someone to take care of the children and to take care of you." So I think this is another issue that we all struggle with when we are mothers and artists and professional women, how to navigate finding space for our work, finding the right support, whether it's family members who step in or other people, caretakers who can help. And I also love the fact that Caitlin's working on Stable, because she, of all people, knows that we must have a room of one's own to be a mother, to have space to work. It's wonderful when you can work with your children and make beautiful objects through collaboration, but you also need that space for yourself, and you need to find the support to make that happen. And so I also want to show you the work of Wanda Raimundi Ortiz. Do you all know her? No. She lives in Orlando, Florida, and I got to know her through the Latino Center at the Smithsonian. She's participated in a conference at the Smithsonian American Art Museum, and is making really powerful work about her experience as a Latina. She grew up in the South Bronx and now teaches in Florida at Florida Central University. She came to me about 2 years ago, and she said, "You know, I am so disturbed by the gun violence in this country." This was around the time of the Orlando nightclub shooting. "I'm so concerned about my students. I feel like I need a platform to express my fear as a mother of a son who has brown skin." And I said, "Well, why don't you propose a performance for the National Portrait Gallery's Identify series about this?" Because there's nothing like having work shown steps from the Capitol, not far from the White House, in our great hall where Lincoln greeted his inaugural guest for his second inaugural ball. So she came and meditated on that space, and she came up with a performance that involved the Howard University Gospel Choir, that also involved a DJ who she brought in from Orlando, who played a mix of music about social justice. And she asked the audience to sit with her, listen to the music, and as people felt inspired to come and be held by her, and position themselves as her child, and she would hold them through a musical piece. This was a quite powerful participatory experience that lasted for about 2 hours in the museum, and one by one visitors got up to be held by her, and I'm going to try to play a clip from this. It's showing here, but It's okay. Yeah, no. So what was happening is the Howard University Gospel Choir was encircling her, behind her, and she was holding.
You want to turn the computer our way?
People. I could turn it and you could see, try to see it. Yeah, that's a good idea. You could even unplug it if you have to show people.
And you can expand it.
Oh, here, I'll let you go play it from the beginning. You can even unplug it, because I don't have to go back to the stuff. Oh, well, actually, you have to go back to the stuff. Okay. And if anyone wants to see it later, I could keep the computer available. But it was an extremely powerful performance, and it has led Wanda to become even more active in her community in Orlando as someone who speaks out against gun violence and is a real community, oh goodness, leader. Sorry. Okay, so maybe we'll just. Sorry, no, it's fine. So I brought her in because like Caitlin and like Ruth Azala, like Sylvia Plath, who was so deeply engaged in speaking out about current political events and marching against the hydrogen bomb, Wanda Raymundi Ortiz is using her experience of motherhood to create new and extremely powerful work, and also to work on social justice issues in her community. Oh,
there it
that would be
goes.
a word. But we'll keep going. So this brings me to Caitlin's work that actually I saw for the first time with my daughter, who was 8 years old. And she was absolutely obsessed with this. She said, "Mom, we have to have this in our house." And I said, okay, and I've never really seen my daughter Lucille respond that way to contemporary art. We take the children to museums. Sometimes I get worried they're going to actually get tired of coming to museums. But this was the first time she had come to a contemporary art show in a private home to look at Caitlin's work with me and to hear more from Caitlin about the work. And I was so fascinated in her response. And I said, you know, Caitlin found this object and this wasp with her children. And how interesting is it that they put together this beautiful composition? And she said, I know, but I love it because I want to know if the wasp is alive. And I said, I don't know. And she said, and I want to know if the wasp is trying to move on the circle. And I thought that's really an interesting observation. And then she said, I wonder if he's going to die if he is alive. So all of these are really kind of deep questions about this one image. And now we do have this in our home, and it generates all sorts of discussions. But just thinking about Lucille's response, I went back to what you said about Annabelle in your early series. And I sort of looked at a few of those sentences that I read earlier. Each frame is carefully constructed, but what lies just beyond is uncertain, perhaps threatening and ultimately left for wonder. They, and here I could say they in terms of these objects, but I think you could also insert children. offer us the opportunity to create stories about life and death, power and vulnerability, magnificence and uncertainty. So I love thinking about Caitlin's entire body of work, going back to Annabelle, before you were a mother, with these themes about death, power, and vulnerability, but playing out in a whole new way through the lens of motherhood in this amazing body of work. And it makes me think about Ruth Asawa again, and her quote, "Doing is living. That is all that matters." So with that, I'd love to open this up for conversation and hear from you, Caitlin, about whether some of my observations are observations that you've been thinking about, or if they're not at all. We can talk about that.
I love to hear the way you're relating it to other women artists, and I haven't thought of myself in relation to these artists specifically, so it's really interesting to hear those things. One thing that I do want to make clear, actually, and it's kind of important in terms of these photographs, is that while the objects were collected as a collaboration, these images were made by me. So it was one of those things where it was me sort of reclaiming myself as an artist, which is really an important thing for me to be able to do because motherhood is all consuming. So it was a way for me to feel like I was being productive with my kids instead of kind of feeling guilty for not doing my work, you know? So I was able to all of these pieces were done in that similar way, where I was able to take something very routine and make it something else. And that helped me sort of get out of the motherhood rut, which maybe some of you have experienced. So I want it's like a way of reclaiming.
Yes,
yeah.
no, that's great. And
Yeah.
yes, thank you for clarifying that. And,
Yeah.
I knew that
I know you knew that, but I just wanted to say.
these were constructed by you, but the objects found with the children.
Yeah.
And also the idea of repetition
Mhm.
and trying to get out of this rut of these daily routines that can feel like they're sort of closing you in a way, but opening that up. And it makes me think of just the activities of folding laundry, of doing the dishes. Sometimes actually you have to do those things if you're creative to get to the place where you're about to produce something. And there's something about that, just the household chores, that people weren't really talking about in scholarship that much, but that kind of repetition can be generative and productive if you're open to it and if you use it in a way that actually leads to creativity.
Yeah. For instance, this piece back here, Circadian Drive, I think about that motion of making the marks sort of as the same type of activity as doing the dishes. I actually think